Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is KripThirteen, and in today's video, we are going to be looking at Hu Tao and Elemental Mastery. Is Elemental Mastery actually a good stat for Hu Tao? I'm going to be showing you how Elemental Mastery affects her damage output when compared to HP percent. In order to do that, I'm going to replace her HP Sands artifact with Elemental Mastery. I will also show you how Elemental Mastery as a substat compares to HP percent substats. And finally, I'm gonna see how the Dragon's Bane performs with an Elemental Mastery Sands artifact versus HP percent to show you how much Elemental Mastery is a little bit too much Elemental Mastery. And so before we jump into this, my calculations are done using a level 80 Hu Tao with talent level 8 with the Blackcliff pole, and also I'm using the Staff of Homa with the less than 50% HP buff. I am also using plus 20 artifacts. And since I'm not really taking into account any substats, the damage that you'll see in game is definitely going to be higher than I calculate here. If we use an HP percent artifact, our non-reaction damage is going to be higher. If we go with the Elemental Mastery for our Sands artifact, then our reaction damage is higher. This is the main thing that you need to know when we look at the differences between HP percent and Elemental Mastery. There is a 16.9% difference in damage between our non-reaction damage across the two different builds. To put this into perspective, that is 7,410 damage with the Elemental Mastery Sands build and 8,776 with the HP percent build on our charged attacks. And then when we are creating elemental reactions, there is an 11.4% difference between the two builds. And so again, for perspective here, that's 14,756 on our Elemental Mastery Sands build and 13,164 on our HP percent Sands build. And these percentages were the same for both the Blackcliff and the Staff of Homa. So even if we use different weapons, the percentages are pretty much the same. So at a base level, the percentage difference is higher for non-reaction damage if we decide to go with HP percent on our Sands over Elemental Mastery. However, this does begin to change as we add more attack percent onto our build. For example, if we have one stack on the Blackcliff pole, we get an extra 12% to our attack. The change is now 16.3 difference on our non-reaction damage and 12% on our reaction damage. So the change is very slight. And then as we add more attack percent, that gap closes even more. So at 3 stacks, the non-reaction damage difference is now only 15.3 and the elemental reaction damage goes up to 13. What this means is that our Elemental Mastery Sands build is scaling a little bit better with more attack percent than the HP percent build. So in this particular situation, that attack percent was just from our weapon. So in a more practical build, you'll have more attack percent from your artifacts that can continue to close that gap. But again, this is going to come down to luck because it did take 36 attack percent to close that gap by just a couple percent. So the thing to think about here is that the percent difference on our non-reaction damage is higher than our elemental reaction damage, but elemental reaction damage is the larger number. So even though it's a lower percent, the actual number value is going to be larger since the number itself is just larger. Okay, so now let's look into substats. So let's say we rolled 34.8 HP percent on one build and 138 Elemental Mastery on another build. This would mean that we rolled 6 times onto HP percent or Elemental Mastery with the highest tier roll across any 5 of our artifact pieces. So 138 Elemental Mastery is the equivalent of 34.8 HP percent if we had the same exact luck and rolled exactly the same amount of times. So first, if we start with our HP Sands build, there is an 11% difference on both our non-reaction damage and reaction damage. And to give you guys a tangible number, that is 9,796 versus 8,776 damage for our charged attacks. And then it's going to be 14,694 versus 16,448 on our vaporized charged attacks. So you can see here that although the percent difference is the same, where our HP percent Sans build with more HP on it will do more damage with its regular charged attacks by about 1000 damage, but will deal about 2000 less damage on its vaporized charged attacks. And then obviously vice versa, if you put Elemental Mastery for substats on your HP Sans build, your normal charged attacks will deal about 1000 damage less, but your vaporized charged attacks will deal 2000 more. Now if we move these substats onto the Elemental Mastery Sans build, there is now a 13% difference in our non-reaction damage and only a 1% difference on our reaction damage. So adding HP percent substats onto an Elemental Mastery Sans build gives us just as much elemental reaction damage as adding more Elemental Mastery substats. But using HP percent gives you 13% more damage on your non-reactions. So that means adding HP percent on Elemental Mastery Sans builds is going to be much better than adding more Elemental Mastery. So this basically tells us that too much Elemental Mastery is not good, because HP percent will be able to bring up your reaction damage and also makes your non-reaction attacks deal more damage. This means that there isn't really any overall best build. Elemental Mastery Sans with HP percent substats is almost literally exactly the same as HP percent Sans builds with Elemental Mastery substats. The difference with these calculations is literally 7 damage, so it's so below 1% that you won't even notice it. The thing that you should get from this is that you should not stack HP percent on HP percent Sans builds and Elemental Mastery on Elemental Mastery Sans builds. You should try to aim to get a mix and even amount of both HP percent and Elemental Mastery. So if you take a Dragon's Bane, and if you add Elemental Mastery on top of Elemental Mastery on top of Elemental Mastery, then, well, it pretty much just becomes a meme build, because you can get the same amount of reaction damage if you used HP percent in place of those Elemental Mastery substats, or wherever you decided to get Elemental Mastery from, and your non-reaction damage would be higher. And if you keep piling on the Elemental Mastery on this build, at some point your reaction damage is actually going to be lower than the build with HP percent. So again, the point is that too much Elemental Mastery is not going to be good. So this means that neither stat is actually strictly better than the other, but this does mean that you shouldn't ignore Elemental Mastery completely. What you should do is consider putting on at least some of it in your build, and once you hit a good amount of Elemental Mastery, then go for HP percent. This is because Elemental Mastery kind of has a soft cap. That's why I would try getting some of that from substats first. I think that most people right now are using HP percent on their Sans artifact, so for those people, you should try to build some Elemental Mastery from your substats. But for those of you who haven't built your Hu Tao yet, and you can't seem to roll an HP percent Sans artifact, check your inventory for an Elemental Mastery Sans artifact. You can use that instead and try to build for HP percent substats. So Hu Tao builds are pretty much kind of like a puzzle and very flexible in that sense. And you should really only consider Elemental Mastery if you are playing Hu Tao in a Vaporized or Mount comp. If your playstyle doesn't really have you creating any elemental reactions, then you should probably just ignore Elemental Mastery. However, if you find that in your playstyle you're not really creating elemental reactions very often, then don't go for the Elemental Mastery on your build. Just keep it simple and go for HP percent. Thank you so much if you made it this far, and I hope you learned something about how Elemental Mastery affects Hu Tao's damage. If you learned something or if you liked this video, don't forget to give me a thumbs up and maybe even consider subscribing to the channel. Alright guys, until next time, I will see you later.